My name is Michael, and my story starts in a family where favoritism ran deep, starting from my childhood. My sister Amy, who's 3 years younger than me, has always been the golden child in our family, especially in the eyes of our father. From the very beginning, I could feel the difference. While Amy was showered with extravagant gifts and attention, my life felt like it was full of missed opportunities and overlooked achievements. Growing up, I began to notice these subtle differences between us. One particular memory stands out from when I was 5 and Amy was 2. It was my birthday, and my parents threw her a massive celebration complete with a professional face painter, a bouncy castle, and even a petting zoo. In contrast, my birthday was just a small family gathering with a store-bought cake. This set the tone for the rest of my childhood. Amy was always the center of attention. She was given the latest toys and clothes, while I was left to fend for myself, saving up my allowance for months just to buy something nice. When I got my new bike at the age of 10, Amy threw a fit because she wanted one too. Instead of teaching her the value of patience and saving, my parents went out and bought her an even nicer bike than mine. The favoritism didn't stop there. Amy was constantly the focus of our parents' attention. I remember numerous school events where my parents would attend Amy's performances but miss mine. I recall practicing for weeks for a major scene in a school play, only to have them arrive an hour late, completely missing my moment. They had been with Amy, comforting her because she had a stomach ache, a problem that had miraculously disappeared by the time I asked her about it. It was clear to me that no matter how hard I worked, I could never meet their expectations. Even in academics, no matter how much effort I put in, it was never enough. I would join clubs, get straight A's, and even win awards, but my parents barely acknowledged my accomplishments. Amy, on the other hand, could do the bare minimum, and she would be celebrated with a celebratory dinner and a new phone. I joined the math club and became the editor of the school newspaper, all while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, but my parents never seemed to notice or care. When Amy barely scraped through high school, they showered her with praise for knowing herself and not attending college. They even bought her a car as a graduation gift. Emotionally, this constant favoritism took its toll on me. I began to struggle with anxiety and depression, and it wasn't until I started therapy in college that I began to understand that none of it was my fault. Years of trying to gain their approval had left me with low self-esteem, and I had to work hard to learn to validate myself. By the time I graduated from college, I had achieved a lot on my own. I got a decent job in finance and even bought my own house. Still, my parents didn't seem proud. It was clear that no matter what I did, I was never going to be good enough for them. Then, in 2020, everything changed. My grandfather passed away, and with his death came an inheritance that promised to offer me the financial freedom I'd always dreamed of. My grandfather had built a successful business from the ground up, and his estate was worth a significant amount of money. He had divided his estate equally among all his grandchildren, including me and Amy, along with our cousins. I stood to receive roughly $500,000, which would allow me to pay off my student loans and potentially start my own business someday. It was the kind of windfall I had always hoped for, and for a brief moment I felt like things were finally falling into place. But when the will was read, my parents' reaction was far from what I had expected. They became agitated when they saw how much I was set to inherit. Later that day, they pulled me aside and told me they felt it was unfair that I received an equal portion. According to them, Amy, who was still living at home and working part-time at a coffee shop, needed the money more than I did because she was struggling. I was stunned by their words but tried to keep my cool. I explained that Grandpa had made his decision, and I had no right to give up what he had left me. They were insistent. They argued that it would be the morally right thing for me to do. They demanded that I hand over my inheritance to Amy. I was taken aback. How could they ask me to do this? I tried to reason with them, but it became clear they weren't listening. My father pulled out all the stops, reminding me of everything they had done for me, like paying for my braces and letting me stay at home during college. But he conveniently ignored the fact that Amy had been given far more, like the car and the endless shopping sprees. It felt like the final blow in a long history of being dismissed and belittled by my parents. Then things took a turn for the worse. My father, who had been named the executor of Grandpa's will, decided to take matters into his own hands. He told me that he would reinterpret Grandpa's wishes and give Amy my entire share of the inheritance. He said that Grandpa would have wanted it that way, especially since he was worried about Amy's future. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not only was this illegal, but it was also a painful reminder of how little my parents thought of me. I stood my ground, but my parents were enraged. My mother accused me of speaking ill of the deceased, and my dad tried to manipulate me emotionally by reminding me of how much they had sacrificed for me over the years. But I knew I couldn't give in this time. This was my chance to finally stand up for myself. I wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully mine. After my parents attempted to manipulate me into giving up my inheritance, I was left in a state of shock and disbelief. I never imagined my family would resort to such lengths to get what they wanted. My grandfather, who had always been a quiet, hard-working man, had left his estate evenly distributed among his grandchildren, including Amy and me. His decision, made with his own values and judgment, was now being questioned by the very people who had always made me feel less than. The argument that my parents made, that Amy needed the money more because she was struggling, stung deeply. Amy, at 25, was living at home with them, working part-time at a coffee shop. She had made little effort to pursue her education or career, yet my parents had always gone above and beyond to make sure she never had to worry about anything. They paid for her car, helped her with every need, and constantly praised her for doing the bare minimum. Meanwhile, I worked tirelessly to achieve academic and career success, only to be met with criticism and indifference. The unfairness of it all hit me like a ton of bricks. But my parents were persistent. My father, as the executor of Grandpa's will, claimed he could reinterpret Grandpa's intentions and simply give my share to Amy. He said that Grandpa would have wanted it that way, especially considering Amy's uncertain future. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad was trying to justify taking away what Grandpa had decided was mine. It felt like another betrayal, another slap in the face. At that moment, I realized I had to take action. I couldn't just sit back and let them walk all over me. I couldn't let them rewrite history and steal what was rightfully mine, not after all the years of favoritism, neglect, and emotional manipulation. I had worked too hard for too long to let them dictate my life anymore. I tried reasoning with them, pointing out that Grandpa had treated all of us equally and had made sure his will reflected that. But my parents weren't listening. They only became more agitated, more insistent that I give up my share. It was clear they didn't see me as an equal. To them, Amy's future was more important than my own hard work and accomplishments. I knew that if I gave in, it would only reinforce the dynamic that had plagued our family for years, the dynamic that told me I was never enough. That's when I decided to take the next step. I called my paternal grandmother, Grandpa's widow, who had always been a voice of reason and support in our family. I explained the situation to her, and she immediately became enraged. "What your parents are doing is illegal," she told me. "They have no right to take your inheritance and give it to Amy. This is not what your grandfather wanted." Grandma was a force to be reckoned with. She had always been fiercely protective of us grandchildren and had a strong sense of justice. She knew that Grandpa had always been proud of my achievements and had worked hard to ensure we all had equal opportunities. She sent me copies of the will and some other documents that made it clear that Grandpa's wishes were being violated. He had even included a clause in his will that stated anyone who tried to alter the distribution of his estate would forfeit their portion. Armed with this new information, I confronted my parents. I couldn't let them get away with this. I told them that Grandma had sent me the documents and that what they were doing was not only wrong but illegal. My dad's face went pale when I mentioned the clause in the will. He tried to defend himself, claiming that he was just trying to help Amy. But I could see the guilt written all over his face. He knew he had crossed a line. I also pointed out that Grandpa had always been proud of me. He had encouraged me to pursue my dreams, to work hard, and to never give up on my goals. It was a painful reminder of all the times my parents had belittled my accomplishments, but it was also a wake-up call. I wasn't just fighting for money, I was fighting for my own self-worth, for the validation I had been denied my entire life. Despite their protests, my parents eventually backed down. But the damage was done. They were furious with me, accusing me of betraying the family and turning everyone against them. My dad even threatened to cut me out of his will entirely. But I wasn't afraid of losing their money or their approval anymore. I had spent too many years chasing after their love and acceptance, only to be left empty-handed. This time, I was standing up for myself and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. The fallout from the dispute was intense. My parents distanced themselves from me, and the tension in the family became unbearable. My dad's siblings, who had always been closer to me, rallied behind me, but even they were caught in the crossfire. Family gatherings became awkward and tense, and I found myself avoiding them altogether. The weight of the situation was overwhelming, and I began to feel like I was once again the target of my parents' manipulation. But I didn't let it break me. I had already come so far, and I wasn't going to let their toxic behavior destroy my progress. Amy, for her part, was caught in the middle. She didn't want to challenge our parents, but she also wasn't comfortable with their demands. She privately apologized to me for not standing up for me sooner. We began to talk more and, over time, developed a deeper understanding of one another. Amy admitted that being the favorite child hadn't been all it was cracked up to be. She had never learned to be independent because our parents had always done everything for her. She had been shielded from the realities of the world, and it was clear she was struggling to find her own path. As much as I wanted her to take a stronger stance against our parents, I understood her hesitation. For years she had been conditioned to seek their approval just as I had been. But with time I began to see a change in her. She decided to go back to school, using some of her inheritance to pay for college. It was a big step for her and I couldn't have been prouder. We both had a long way to go, but this felt like a step in the right direction. The battle over my inheritance was not the only conflict simmering in my life. As the weeks passed, the rift between me and my parents deepened, and the emotional toll became harder to ignore. Every interaction felt like walking on eggshells. My parents, especially my dad, refused to accept that I had the right to my inheritance. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't just hand it over to Amy and avoid all the drama. But for me, it wasn't about the money, it was about standing up for myself, for my hard work, and for my sense of worth. The tension was unbearable. Every time I walked into my parents' house or spoke to them on the phone, I was met with accusations, guilt trips, and a refusal to acknowledge the damage they had done. My mom would cry, telling me I was breaking the family apart, while my dad would accuse me of being selfish and ungrateful. It was as if they couldn't see that their favoritism had been poisoning our family dynamic for years. All they could see was their perception of me as the ungrateful child, the one who had always strived for more but never seemed to get it. One of the hardest parts of this ordeal was the realization that, even though I had finally asserted myself and stood up to my parents, I still longed for their approval. For so long, I had internalized the belief that I was not good enough unless I earned their love and validation. The inheritance was a symbol of that long-held desire to be seen and acknowledged for who I truly was. Yet, when it came time to fight for it, I had to come to terms with the fact that I could never get the validation I needed from them. They would never truly understand or appreciate my worth because, in their eyes, I had always been second best to Amy. Despite everything, I didn't want to cut ties with my parents entirely. I knew that this was a moment of reckoning not just for me but for them as well. I wasn't asking for their approval anymore, but I did want them to see me, not just as their son, but as an individual capable of making his own choices. It was a difficult line to walk. I had to balance my newfound independence with the deep, almost instinctual need for family. But the reality was clear. I had to make peace with the idea that I might never get the relationship I wanted from them. Then, a breakthrough came when I received a call from my grandmother. She had been a constant source of support throughout this ordeal, offering wisdom and perspective when I needed it most. She had always been the one person in the family who understood me, who saw my worth and validated my achievements. It was because of her that I was able to challenge my parents in the first place. Now she had news that would change everything. Grandma had been in touch with a few family members who were on my side. They had been quietly observing my parents' behavior, and they knew how difficult it had been for me. They also knew that the issues with favoritism were not new, but had been simmering for years. Finally, they were ready to step in. Grandma had convinced them to help me, and together they devised a plan to force my parents to acknowledge the harm they had done, both to me and to the rest of the family. At a family gathering, Grandma decided it was time to confront the issue head-on. She gathered my aunts, uncles, and cousins who had been supportive of me, and we sat down for an open and honest discussion. My parents, of course, were furious. They had no idea that this meeting was happening, and when they walked in to find so many people on my side, their anger was palpable. My mom started crying, trying to turn the conversation back to Amy and how she needed the money more. My dad, still unwilling to accept responsibility, began ranting about how unfair I was being, accusing me of being ungrateful for everything they had done for me. But Grandma wouldn't let them get away with it. She told the entire room about the years of favoritism, about how my parents had always treated me as less than, and how my achievements had been consistently ignored or minimized. She even shared the stories I had long forgotten, the moments where I had been overlooked in favor of Amy, the birthday parties I never had, the academic successes that went uncelebrated. It was painful to hear, but it was also cathartic. For the first time, I felt like my suffering had been acknowledged. As the conversation continued, something unexpected happened. Amy, who had always been the favorite child and had remained largely silent throughout this whole ordeal, began to speak up. She admitted that she had never realized how much I had been hurt by our parents' actions. She shared her own struggles with being constantly sheltered and babied by our parents, and how it had stunted her growth. She had never been given the chance to make her own mistakes or learn from them because my parents had always stepped in to fix things for her. She had always thought that being the golden child was a privilege, but she now realized it had been more of a burden than anything else. It was a revelation. Amy wasn't just standing by me out of obligation. She was seeing things from my perspective for the first time. And that was when I realized that we had both been victims of the same toxic dynamic. I had been striving for my parents' approval, and Amy had been trapped in a cycle of dependency. We had both suffered, just in different ways. By the end of the meeting, things had changed. My parents were still defensive, but they couldn't deny the truth any longer. They finally understood the damage their favoritism had caused, not just to me but to the whole family. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step toward healing. Amy promised to pursue her own path and stop relying on our parents for everything. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly seen. The family drama wasn't over, but it had shifted. I had fought for what was mine, and I had stood up for myself in a way I never thought possible. The healing process had begun, but it was far from easy. Still, I felt empowered. I had found my voice, and that was worth more than any inheritance. The months that followed the family meeting were a mix of personal growth, emotional turmoil, and slow attempts at reconciliation. After the confrontation with my parents, I had expected the tension to dissipate quickly, but I quickly learned that healing such deep wounds takes time. My relationship with my parents remained strained, but I began to see small changes that offered a glimmer of hope for the future. Amy and I started spending more time together, just the two of us, without the pressure of our parents' expectations looming over us. It felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time, we could talk openly about our childhood, our feelings, and the way our parents had treated us. She admitted that, despite being the golden child, she had never felt truly valued or understood. She had always been expected to live up to an ideal image that our parents had set for her, and it had left her feeling lost and incapable of making decisions on her own. Amy's realization about her own struggles made me feel a little less alone. For years, I had seen her as the one who had it all, while I was the one always working harder to gain approval. I had resented her, believing that she had received everything on a silver platter. But now, I could see that our experiences were more similar than I had thought. We had both been pushed into roles we didn't ask for, and both of us had been affected by our parents' actions, albeit in different ways. Despite these breakthroughs in our relationship, things with our parents remained rocky. My dad, in particular, refused to budge. He still believed that Amy deserved the inheritance more than I did, and he couldn't understand why I wasn't willing to just give it to her. The guilt trips continued, and every time I saw him, I felt like I was being judged. He couldn't see past his own anger and disappointment to understand my side of things. My mom, however, had started to show signs of change. After her therapy sessions and some difficult self-reflection, she began to admit that she had made mistakes. She apologized to me more than once, acknowledging that her favoritism had been damaging to both Amy and me. It was a small victory, but it meant a lot. I had spent so many years craving her validation, and while I knew it wasn't the same as receiving it from my father, it was still a step in the right direction. One of the most difficult moments came when my dad tried to guilt me into handing over the inheritance once again. He told me that I was turning my back on everything he had done for me and that I was ruining the family. This time I stood firm. I didn't allow him to manipulate me with guilt. I reminded him that my relationship with my grandfather had always been about my achievements and not about favoritism. I told him that I wasn't doing this out of spite, but because I finally understood my worth and my right to be treated fairly. The guilt, though, wasn't easy to shake. I still felt torn, as if every choice I made to assert my own independence came with the cost of further alienating my parents. There were days when I wanted to give in, to take the easy road and just make peace. But I knew that peace at the cost of my self-respect wasn't real peace at all. It was a hard truth to swallow, but I had to accept that sometimes standing up for myself meant facing uncomfortable consequences. As time passed, I found solace in other parts of my life. My job in finance was progressing well, and I began to save for the future in a way I hadn't before. The inheritance had given me the financial freedom to pay off my student loans and start making real plans for my future, and I knew I needed to use that opportunity wisely. I began thinking about starting my own business, something I had always dreamed of, but had never had the confidence or financial backing to pursue. Amy, too, was finding her own way. She started attending community college, something that shocked everyone in our family. Our parents, particularly our dad, were furious. They tried to guilt her into quitting, but Amy stood her ground. She said that she finally wanted to do something for herself, and for the first time, I saw her truly take ownership of her life. It was inspiring to watch her transform before my eyes. At the same time, the rest of the family was watching closely. My cousins and extended family members, who had always been in the background of our family's drama, began to take a more active role. They saw the changes in Amy and me and, for the first time, began to understand the long-standing issues that had existed in our family. My relationship with my cousins, especially those who had stood by me, grew stronger. We began meeting regularly without the pressure of our parents' expectations, to catch up and support each other. These gatherings became a much-needed escape from the family drama, and it was in these moments that I realized how important it was to surround myself with people who understood me and accepted me for who I was. Despite the turmoil, I started feeling more empowered. I no longer felt the need to chase after my parents' approval. Instead, I focused on building a life that was true to myself, regardless of their opinions. It wasn't always easy, but with every step I took, I felt more confident in my decisions. The changes in my life were profound. I was finally standing up for myself, and in doing so, I was creating a future that I could be proud of. It was hard to let go of the idea of having a traditional, supportive family. But I was starting to see that family wasn't always about blood. It was about the people who loved and supported you no matter what. And in that moment, I realized that I had found my family, not in my parents' expectations, but in the people who truly understood me. The months that followed continued to test my resolve, but I was starting to come to terms with the reality of my family situation. While the emotional wounds of growing up in a household of favoritism hadn't completely healed, I was learning to manage my pain, setting clearer boundaries, and most importantly, finding peace. The key moments of strength I had recently discovered, whether it was standing up to my parents, asserting my right to the inheritance, or finally acknowledging my worth, had become part of my new identity. The relationship with my parents remained a sore subject. My mom, despite her therapy sessions, was still finding it difficult to fully break away from the old patterns. She apologized to me multiple times, but it was often with the underlying expectation that things would just go back to normal. There were still moments where I could feel the tension in her eyes when she looked at me, the guilt weighing heavily on her. She was trying, I could see that. But my dad was a different story. He remained distant, refusing to accept any responsibility for his actions. Even after everything that had happened, he insisted that I should have given up my inheritance to Amy, continuing to accuse me of being selfish and ungrateful. It was as if he was completely blind to the reality of the situation, locked in a state of denial. He had yet to recognize the damage his favoritism had caused and probably never would. It was painful to watch him harden into the version of himself I had feared most, angry, unforgiving, and unrelenting. Despite the tension, I refused to let him manipulate me anymore. The inheritance, though it had been a point of conflict, was ultimately a symbol of a new chapter. It wasn't about the money, it was about finally having something of my own, something my grandfather had given me as an acknowledgement of my accomplishments, something I deserved. And now I had to learn how to use it wisely. Amy and I continued to grow closer during this time. I had to admit, it felt good to have her finally stand up for herself, to see her stepping into a version of herself that I had long wished she would. It was as if, with every step she took toward independence, she was slowly beginning to understand the weight of our childhood, and she was willing to break free from it. Our relationship was still fragile, but it was real. And real, honest communication was what we needed. We began meeting regularly for coffee or dinner, catching up on life without the pressure of our parents' approval hanging over us. These moments were sacred to me. Despite everything, I still felt a deep sense of longing for the type of family I thought I would have. I wanted us to be close, to be able to lean on each other without the pain of favoritism and neglect. But after years of struggling to earn their affection, I realized that I could no longer define my sense of worth by their opinions. I was no longer that lost, anxious child trying to prove something. I had carved out a life for myself, and I would keep building it regardless of what they thought. That realization helped me put a lot of things into perspective. I had spent so much time trying to make them proud, thinking that their love and approval would be the key to my happiness. What I had failed to see was that I was the one who needed to give myself approval first. I had to believe in my own worth and stop waiting for validation from people who were never capable of giving it freely. It wasn't just about the inheritance anymore, it was about living authentically. The more I focused on my personal growth and well-being, the more I realized how much I had been neglecting myself. I had spent so much of my life trying to please my parents that I had lost sight of my own goals, my own aspirations. I had allowed their biased opinions of me to shape the way I saw myself, to feel inadequate for achievements that should have been celebrated. My career had taken a positive turn, and for the first time I felt in control of my future. I was saving more and planning to invest my inheritance wisely, not just in terms of money but in my life. I worked with a financial advisor to set up a long-term investment strategy, and I started researching ways to give back to my community. The idea of starting a business or a nonprofit had always been a dream of mine, but I had never taken the first step. Now I was taking those first steps. I began to explore opportunities to start a community center focused on mental health awareness and financial literacy, something I felt could help people like myself who had struggled with family issues and emotional neglect. Amy, to my surprise, expressed an interest in joining me in this venture. She had begun her own journey of self-discovery, and although she was still very much figuring things out, she said she felt inspired to help others who had been through similar family dynamics. Watching her evolve over the past months was nothing short of miraculous. She was no longer just the baby of the family, living off our parents' support. She had taken control of her own destiny, and it felt like we were finally on equal footing. But the emotional toll of everything that had happened could not be ignored. I still felt anxious at times, especially when I thought about the toll it had taken on my mental health over the years. I had been so consumed by my need to prove myself to my parents that I had neglected my own self-care. But now I was beginning to prioritize my own well-being. I started seeing a therapist again to process the unresolved feelings I had about my parents and to understand how to set healthy boundaries moving forward. The more I worked on healing myself, the more I felt empowered to face whatever challenges lay ahead. I knew the road wouldn't be easy and the wounds from my childhood wouldn't disappear overnight, but I was learning to be okay with that. I was learning to let go of the past and accept that, while I couldn't change what had happened, I could control how I moved forward. The journey wasn't over, but I was finally walking it on my own terms. Months passed, and I continued to navigate the complicated waters of family dynamics, personal healing, and newfound independence. The family drama that had dominated my life for so long seemed to be less overwhelming, but the scars of the past remained. With every step forward, I realized that my relationship with my parents could never go back to what it once was. But that didn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I had learned to live without their constant validation, and though there was pain in the process, it was also freeing. My relationship with Amy had significantly improved. The bond that had been strained for so many years was slowly healing, and I found myself relying on her more than I ever had before. Our sibling relationship had taken on a new depth. We had begun to share our frustrations, our fears, and our dreams in ways that felt real, raw, and unguarded. We were no longer children trying to win our parents' favor. Instead, we were two adults navigating a world where we could stand up for ourselves, together. The initial awkwardness of spending time with Amy without our parents in the picture began to fade. We found ourselves taking small trips together, whether it was to a nearby hiking trail or just grabbing a cup of coffee at a quiet cafe. Those simple moments of connection were priceless. It felt like we were finally becoming the siblings we had always been meant to be, without the weight of favoritism and emotional neglect hanging over us. For me, the most liberating aspect of these changes was the way I began to view myself. In the past, I had been conditioned to believe that my worth was tied to how much my parents approved of me, how much I could achieve to win their attention and admiration. But now, I realized that my worth was intrinsic, independent of their approval. I had worked hard to get to where I was, and I had earned everything I had accomplished. The acknowledgement from my grandfather's will, as much as it had been a source of conflict, had reinforced this truth. My accomplishments, the work I had put in, were worthy of recognition, and I didn't need to rely on my parents to validate that. It wasn't easy, though. The relationship with my dad remained strained. He continued to avoid taking responsibility for his actions and viewed me as an enemy, someone who had betrayed the family by not allowing him to manipulate me. His refusal to accept any wrongdoing was something I couldn't change. For a long time, I struggled with the idea that our relationship would never be what I had hoped it would be. I had to accept that he wasn't going to change, at least not in a way that would satisfy my need for closure. But even in the midst of that, I had grown. I realized that I could love my father without condoning his behavior. I didn't have to carry the burden of his actions anymore. I could set the boundaries I needed, even if that meant distancing myself from him emotionally. It was a painful process, and it hurt to see him so angry and unwilling to move forward, but I no longer saw myself as responsible for his happiness. I couldn't fix him, and I had to let go of the idea that I was the one who needed to heal our relationship. The biggest surprise, perhaps, was my mom's transformation. She had initially tried to manipulate me into giving Amy my inheritance, and she had resorted to guilt-tripping when I stood my ground. But over time, as she continued with therapy and began to reflect on her own behavior, she started to change. She reached out to me, acknowledging the damage she had done, and began apologizing in earnest. Those apologies weren't easy for her, and they didn't erase the years of hurt, but they marked the first step toward healing. We had a few one-on-one lunches where we talked honestly, albeit awkwardly, about our past. Those conversations were tough, full of raw emotion, but they were also the beginning of rebuilding our relationship, albeit on new terms. I didn't expect things to return to the way they had been, but I was learning that healing didn't always mean going back. Sometimes it meant moving forward, creating something new with the pieces left behind. In time, I started focusing more on my future. I had learned so much from this experience about setting boundaries, standing up for myself, and not allowing past pain to define me. With the inheritance I had received, I was able to pay off my college loans and start investing for the future. My financial freedom felt like a weight lifted from my shoulders. I had made plans to pursue my long-term goal of opening a community center, focusing on mental health services and financial literacy. It felt empowering to finally take steps toward something meaningful, something that could help others who had experienced similar struggles. The sense of self-worth I had gained from this entire ordeal was invaluable. I had been forced to confront the ghosts of my past and deal with them head-on. The therapy I had sought out, the support of Amy and my grandmother, and the clarity I had gained through setting boundaries, all of it had led to this new version of myself, someone who was strong, independent, and unapologetically worthy of love and respect. While the family drama wasn't over, I knew I was equipped to handle whatever came next. The ongoing tensions with my dad, the occasional awkward family gatherings, the guilt trips, they were all part of the process, and I was no longer afraid of them. I had my own life now, one that I had built through years of hard work, resilience, and self-discovery. I had learned to be my own source of validation, and in doing so, I had finally found peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid to walk it alone, with Amy by my side. Together, we were rewriting the story of our childhood, one that was no longer defined by favoritism or neglect. We were creating a new legacy, one where we both stood strong, equal, and proud of who we had become. The story illustrates the profound impact of family favoritism and emotional neglect, showing how these patterns can shape an individual's life and self-worth. The key message here is that it's never too late to stand up for oneself, even in the face of overwhelming family pressure. The journey toward self-empowerment involves recognizing one's own value, independent of the validation from those who should have supported you unconditionally. Life is about setting boundaries, acknowledging past hurt, and reclaiming control over one's future. For older adults, this story serves as a reminder that healing is a lifelong process, and self-care and personal boundaries are just as essential in the later stages of life as they are in youth. It's important to remember that family dynamics, while deeply influential, don't have to define our worth or limit our ability to change and grow. Sometimes the relationships we need to focus on are with ourselves, learning to trust our instincts, embrace our achievements, and allow room for self-forgiveness. No matter how deep the wounds from past injustices, each person has the ability to create a life of peace and fulfillment by fostering supportive relationships, seeking therapy, and holding steadfast to the principle that personal happiness and well-being must come first. The story also highlights the power of empathy and reconciliation, especially in mending relationships with siblings and parents. By setting healthy limits and practicing self-compassion, we can move toward healing and emotional freedom at any stage of life. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this story resonated with you and brought some valuable insights into your life. If you got any value from this video, please take a moment to comment 1 below. It really helps us know what you're enjoying and how we can continue bringing you content that matters. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Also, be sure to give this video a like and share it with anyone who might benefit from it. You never know who might need to hear this message. And finally, we'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts or feelings about the video? Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your story or thoughts in the comments. We're all here to support each other. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.